When I signed up for extinct species across the galaxy at Galactic University, I thought it would be an easy A. How hard could it be to learn about dead things, right? Well, apparently very hard, when you are one of those supposedly dead things and nobody bothered to tell you about it. The lecture hall buzzed with the usual morning chaos. Picture your typical college classroom, except instead of hungover freshmen, you've got a delightful mix of tentacled beings, crystalline entities, and what I can only describe as sentient gas clouds trying to figure out how to take notes. I sat in my usual spot in the back corner, hoping my baseball cap and sunglasses would help me blend in. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Professor Kethril bounced into the room with the enthusiasm of a golden retriever who just discovered tennis balls. He was a Vaxorian, which meant he looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a Christmas tree and given it a PhD in biology. His forearms gestured wildly as he spoke, and his compound eyes literally sparkled when he got excited about particularly gruesome extinction events. "Good morning, my wonderful students," he chirped, his voice carrying that distinctive Vaxorian accent that made everything sound like a question. "Today we're going to discuss some absolutely fascinating cases of species who managed to completely wipe themselves out through sheer stupidity. Isn't that marvelous?" The class murmured agreement. I slouched lower in my seat. "Now then," Professor Kethril continued, pulling up a holographic display of various dead civilizations, "who can give me an example of a species that went extinct due to their own spectacular incompetence? Anyone? Don't be shy." Hands, claws, pseudopods, and various other appendages shot up around the room. This was always the part where I tried to become invisible. Not because I didn't know the answers, mind you, but because most of the extinct species they discussed hit a little too close to home. "The Glorbnoids of Sector 7, squeaked Pip, a small, furry creature who looked like a hamster had been crossed with a calculator. "They invented time travel, and immediately used it to go back and uninvent time travel." "Excellent," Professor Kethril beamed. "Anyone else?" "The crystalline minds of Andromeda Prime," offered Thorgan, a rock-like being whose voice sounded like gravel in a blender. "They achieved perfect logical thinking, and logically concluded that existence was illogical, so they all shut themselves off." "Brilliant. Simply brilliant." The professor's excitement was reaching dangerous levels. This is why I love teaching this class. The sheer variety of ways intelligent species can Darwin themselves out of existence never ceases to amaze me. I winced. Darwin, if only he knew. "Now, let me ask you this," Professor Kethril said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Can anyone think of a species that went extinct not through war, not through natural disaster, but through simple, ridiculous bureaucratic incompetence?" The room fell silent. This was my nightmare scenario. I knew exactly which species he was thinking about, and I was pretty sure I was the only one in the room who could give him the real answer. Unfortunately, I was also pretty sure that giving him that answer would lead to what my grandmother would have called a whole heap of trouble. I tried to sink even lower in my seat, but apparently my attempts at invisibility were about as effective as a chocolate teapot. Professor Kethril's compound eyes locked onto me with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. "Jake, my dear boy," he exclaimed, using the human name I'd registered under because I figured nobody would know what it meant. "You've been unusually quiet today. Surely someone who chose to study extinct species must have some thoughts on the matter." The entire class turned to look at me. 37 pairs of eyes, compound eyes, eye stalks, and photosensitive patches all focused on the guy in the baseball cap who just wanted to pass Biology 101 without incident. I could feel my face heating up under their collective gaze. My internal monologue was screaming various unprintable things, but outwardly I just cleared my throat nervously. "Well, Professor," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I suppose there might be one example that comes to mind." The words hung in the air like a bad smell at a diplomatic dinner. Professor Kethril practically vibrated with excitement, and I realized with growing horror that I had just painted myself into the most uncomfortable corner in the known galaxy. "Yes," he prompted, all four arms now gesturing encouragingly. "Please, share with the class." I looked around the room one more time, hoping for a fire alarm, alien invasion, or spontaneous black hole. No such luck. Just 37 expectant faces waiting for me to explain how my entire species had managed to get themselves officially classified as extinct through what could only be described as the most embarrassing clerical error in galactic history. So here's the thing about being put on the spot in front of a classroom full of aliens when you're trying to maintain a low profile. It's like being asked to explain a magic trick when you are the magic trick. Uncomfortable doesn't even begin to cover it. I took a deep breath and raised my hand, slowly, like I was defusing a bomb made of social anxiety and bureaucratic nightmares. I began, which was already not a great start. Actually, Professor, I think there might be a slight misunderstanding about one particular species. The murmuring started immediately. Zara 7, the insectoid sitting 2 rows ahead of me, began frantically scribbling notes with all 6 of her arms. She was the type who took detailed notes on everything, including the professor's casual observations about the weather. I could practically hear her internal categorization system clicking away. Possible new information alert. Academic excitement level, maximum. Professor Kethrel's compound eyes somehow managed to get even brighter. Oh? Do tell, Jake. Which species might that be? I cleared my throat again. At this point, I was clearing it so much I probably qualified for a medical study on nervous throat-clearing behaviors. Well, you see, I said, trying to sound casual while my heart attempted to beat its way out of my chest, humans aren't actually extinct. You know that sound a record makes when it suddenly stops? That's exactly what happened to the classroom, except instead of a record, it was 37 alien minds processing information that didn't compute. Blurks, a blob-like being who took skepticism to an art form, made a sound like a deflating balloon. That's impossible, they gurgled. Humans have been officially extinct for over 2 decades. It's in the galactic registry and everything. Yes, well, I said, feeling sweat starting to form despite the climate control. That's kind of the problem. See, we're not actually extinct. We're just really, really bad at paperwork. The silence stretched on like a bad first date. Professor Kethrel was staring at me with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces were missing and the other half were on fire. Jake, he said slowly, are you suggesting that you have access to classified information about this supposedly extinct species? Oh boy, this was the moment, the point of no return. I could either double down on the lie and spend the rest of the semester making up increasingly elaborate stories about my research sources, or I could tell the truth and probably end up as a specimen in the university xenobiology lab. Not exactly, I said, then immediately realized how suspicious that sounded. I mean, yes, but also no, but mostly yes, in a way that's completely legal and not at all the result of me being the thing we're talking about. Smooth, Jake, real smooth. Zara Zevin's note-taking had reached frenzied levels. I was pretty sure she was going to need medical attention for repetitive motion injuries at this rate. Blorks just stared at me with what I assumed was their version of a deeply skeptical expression, which, on a blob, mostly looked like mild indigestion. Young Jake, Professor Kethrel said, moving closer to my desk with the slow, deliberate movements of a predator who'd just spotted something interesting. You seem to know quite a lot about this particular extinct species. I read a lot, I said weakly. Fascinating. And where exactly did you read about living humans? Because according to every official source in the galaxy, they all died out after what the reports called catastrophic administrative failure resulting in complete societal collapse. I laughed. It came out as more of a strangled wheeze, but I was aiming for casual amusement. Funny thing about that, I said, realizing I was now fully committed to this conversational train wreck. Turns out the reports might have been slightly exaggerated. The classroom erupted in whispers. I caught fragments of alien conversations. Impossible. Cover up. I knew it. Does this mean my thesis on human extinction patterns is worthless now? Professor Kethrel held up all 4 of his hands for silence, and the room obeyed instantly. His academic authority was apparently strong enough to override even the most excited scientific gossiping. Jake, he said, and I could hear the barely contained excitement in his voice. I think you need to explain exactly how you came by this information. Because if what you're suggesting is true, then we're looking at the most significant xenobiological discovery in recent galactic history. I looked around the room one more time. 37 faces filled with scientific curiosity, academic ambition, and what I was starting to recognize as the sort of predatory interest usually reserved for extremely rare research opportunities. Yeah, I was definitely in trouble now. You know what's worse than being the center of attention in a room full of aliens? Being the center of attention in a room full of aliens who think you've just made the discovery of the century. Professor Kethrel had that gleam in his compound eyes that I'd learned to associate with either breakthrough scientific moment or someone's about to become a very unwilling research subject. Now then, Jake, he said, settling into what I could only describe as academic interrogation mode. Let's start with the basics. When exactly did these humans go extinct according to your sources? I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. Well, that's just it, Professor. They didn't, but the official reports clearly state. The official reports are wrong, I interrupted, then immediately regretted it. You never interrupt a professor mid-lecture. That's like interrupting a Vulcan during meditation, or a Klingon during dinner. It just doesn't end well. Professor Kethrel paused, his forearms frozen mid-gesture. Wrong? The Galactic Census Bureau made an error? The way he said it, you'd think I'd just suggested that gravity was optional, or that the speed of light was more of a gentle recommendation. More like a series of errors, I said, warming to the topic despite my better judgment. See, it started with the 2387 Galactic Census. Earth was supposed to be surveyed, but there was a scheduling conflict. Zara 7's note-taker had now reached supernatural levels of intensity. I was pretty sure she was transcribing not just my words, but also my breathing patterns and the precise angle of my baseball cap. A scheduling conflict? Professor Kethrel prompted. Yeah. The survey ship got diverted to handle a diplomatic crisis in the Vega system, something about a trade dispute over singing crystals. So Earth got marked as survey postponed in the system. Blorks made a sound like a wet laugh. And let me guess, they gurgled, postponed became permanent? Worse, I said, getting into the story now. The next census cycle, a junior clerk saw survey postponed and assumed it meant the planet had become inaccessible, so they marked it as potentially uninhabitable. Oh no, whispered Zara 7, her antennae twitching with what I assumed was either excitement or horror, possibly both. It gets better, I continued. The cycle after that, another clerk saw potentially uninhabitable, and figured that meant everyone was dead, so they updated the status to extinct due to environmental collapse. Professor Kethrel was now staring at me with the sort of fascination usually reserved for particularly interesting bacteria cultures. And no one ever double-checked. Here's where it gets really good, I said, realizing I was now fully committed to this explanation and there was no going back. By the time someone noticed the error, it had been official for over a decade. The Galactic Registry had published papers on human extinction. There were academic conferences. Someone even wrote a thesis on lessons from the human catastrophe. My colleague, Professor Vorthak, wrote that thesis, Professor Kethrel said slowly. It won the Galactic Prize for Xenosociology. Right. Well, when the registry realized their mistake, they faced a choice. They could either admit to the most embarrassing clerical error in galactic history, invalidate years of academic work, and probably get sued by every university in known space, or, Blork prompted, though their tone suggested they already knew where this was going. Or they could just leave the humans listed as extinct and hope nobody noticed. The classroom exploded into chaos. Half the students were shouting questions, the other half were frantically accessing their data tablets to cross-reference information, and Zara 7 looked like she was about to vibrate right out of her exoskeleton from pure academic excitement. Professor Kethrel raised all four hands for silence again, but it took significantly longer this time. Jake, he said once the room had settled down, this is an extraordinary claim. You're suggesting that an entire species has been incorrectly classified as extinct for over 2 decades due to bureaucratic incompetence? That's exactly what I'm suggesting. And you know this how, exactly? This was it. The moment of truth. I could either confess everything right now, or I could try to dig my way out of this hole. Unfortunately, my brain chose option 3, dig deeper. I may have encountered some of them, I said carefully. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the building's ventilation system humming 3 floors up. You've encountered living humans? Professor Kethrel's voice had gone up about 3 octaves. A few living humans. Maybe more than a few. Where? Around. Around where, Jake? I looked around the classroom one more time. Every single being in the room was staring at me with the kind of intensity usually reserved for natural disasters or really good gossip. Well, I said, making what was probably the worst decision of my academic career. Mostly on Earth, actually. Turns out they never left. If I thought the classroom was chaotic before, I was clearly underestimating the academic enthusiasm of 37 alien students who'd just been told they were witnessing history in the making. The noise level went from mild excitement to someone just announced free pizza in the cafeteria. Professor Kethrel, however, had gone completely silent. He was staring at me with the sort of expression you'd expect from someone who'd just been told that gravity was actually just a really persistent rumor. Jake, he said slowly, are you telling me that you have had direct contact with living specimens of an allegedly extinct species? The way he said specimens made me deeply uncomfortable. It was like being referred to as a particularly interesting bug in someone's collection. I said, trying to backtrack, contact is a strong word, more like observed, from a distance, academic distance. Fascinating. Professor Kethrel's excitement was reaching dangerous levels again. Tell me, what behavioral patterns did you observe? Were they exhibiting any of the pre-extinction stress behaviors documented in the literature? This was getting out of hand fast. I glanced around the room, looking for support, but found only eager alien faces hanging on my every word. Even Blorks had stopped looking skeptical and started looking interested, which somehow made everything worse. Anybody seemed pretty normal, I said weakly. Normal how? 07 interjected, her antennae practically vibrating with curiosity. Were they engaging in typical human social structures, tool use, ritualistic behaviors? I guess. They were doing regular human things. You know, working, eating, complaining about taxes, binge-watching old entertainment programs. Wait, Professor Kethra interrupted, pulling out his own data tablet. You observed their entertainment consumption patterns? This is incredible. Jake, I need you to demonstrate some of these behaviors for the class. I felt all the blood drain from my face. Demonstrate? Yes, show us typical human behaviors. This is a once-in-a-lifetime educational opportunity. I don't think that's necessary. Nonsense! Professor Kethril was now bouncing on his feet, which was deeply disturbing to watch. Class, gather around. We're about to witness authentic human behavioral patterns. Before I could object, 37 aliens had surrounded my desk like I was some kind of educational exhibit. Which, I realized with growing horror, was exactly what I'd become. Now then, Jake, Professor Kethril said, data tablet ready. Show us a typical human mating display. I nearly choked on my own tongue. A what now? Human courtship rituals. The literature mentions something called dancing as a pre-copulatory behavior. Demonstrate. I am not demonstrating human mating rituals in front of a biology class. Then perhaps a territorial display? Suggested Thorgal, helpfully. Humans were known for their aggressive posturing, correct? Or feeding behaviors, added Pip. Show us how humans consume nutrients. I looked around desperately, but there was no escape. I was surrounded by enthusiastic xenobiologists who thought they'd just discovered a living dinosaur. This is ridiculous, I muttered. What was that? Professor Kethra leaned closer. Was that a human vocalization pattern? A form of communication? It was me saying this is ridiculous. Fascinating. The specimen appears to be expressing frustration through vocal modulation and aggressive body language. Note the defensive posture, class. Zara 7 was taking notes so fast I was worried her writing appendages might catch fire. Should I record this for the xenobiology department? Absolutely, Professor Kethril exclaimed. This is groundbreaking research. That's when Blorks decided to join the fun. If he's really encountered living humans, they said in their gurgling voice, then he should be able to prove it. Ask him something only a human would know. Excellent idea, Professor Kethril turned to me with renewed enthusiasm. Jake, what's the human word for the fear of being buried alive? Tapophobia, I answered automatically, then immediately realized my mistake. The entire class gasped. Well, the ones with lungs gasped. The others made various sounds of surprise that ranged from crystalline chiming to what sounded like a deflating balloon orchestra. Incredible! Professor Kethril was practically dancing now. How could you possibly know such specific human terminology unless you had extensive contact with the species? Lucky guess, I tried. What about their reproductive cycles? Asked Zara 7. How long do humans gestate their offspring? 9 months. The average lifespan? About 80 years, give or take. Their preferred ambient temperature range? Somewhere between 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on humidity and personal preference. Every answer I gave just made things worse. The aliens were getting more excited, Professor Kethril was taking more notes, and I was running out of ways to explain how I knew so much about humans without actually admitting I was one. This is unprecedented, Professor Kethril announced to the room. Jake, you've clearly had more contact with this species than anyone else in recorded galactic history. We need to get you to the xenobiology department immediately. The xenobiology department? Yes. Think of the research opportunities, the papers we could write, the conferences we could attend. You could be the most famous xenobiologist in the galaxy. But I'm not a xenobiologist, I protested. Details, Professor Kethra waved a dismissive hand. What matters is that you're our only link to a living, extinct species. This is the discovery of the century. I looked around the room at 37 pairs of eager alien eyes and realized with growing dread that my simple college biology class had just turned into the worst job interview of my life. And I was pretty sure I was about to get the position whether I wanted it or not. Let me tell you something about the moment when you realize you've gone from college student trying to pass a class to potential laboratory specimen for overeager alien scientists. It's not a good moment. It's the kind of moment that makes you question every life choice that led you there, starting with your decision to leave Earth in the first place. Professor Kethril was now pacing around my desk like a predator who'd cornered particularly interesting prey. "We'll need to set up controlled observation sessions," he was saying, mostly to himself but loud enough for the whole class to hear. "Document feeding patterns, sleep cycles, social interactions. Oh, and we absolutely must get a full biological workup. Blood samples, tissue analysis, genetic sequencing." "Whoa, hold on there," I said, standing up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. "Nobody said anything about blood samples." "Don't worry, Jake," Zara 7 chirped helpfully. "The xenobiology department has excellent facilities, very humane. You'll barely notice the monitoring equipment." "Monitoring equipment?" "Just basic biometric sensors," Professor Kethril assured me, as if that was supposed to be comforting. "Heart rate, brain activity, hormone levels, digestive processes. Standard stuff for studying living specimens." There it was again, that word, specimen. I looked around the room one more time and made a decision that would either save my life or get me expelled from the university. Possibly both. "You know what?" I said, forcing a laugh that came out about as natural as a chocolate rocket ship. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here." "Oh?" Professor Kethril's compound eyes focused on me with laser precision. "Yeah, see, I'm not actually... I haven't really... The thing is..." I was floundering like a fish in a philosophy lecture, but I pressed on. "I'm not human." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear someone's digestive system gurgling 3 rows over. "What?" Zara 7's antennae drooped with disappointment. "Right. I'm actually a very convincing alien mimic from the Shapeshifter Nebula. We're known for our, exceptional impersonation abilities." Blurks made a sound like a deflating whoopee cushion. "That's the worst lie I've ever heard." No, it's true," I insisted, backing toward the door. "I've been studying human behaviors for my thesis on extinct species mimicry. Very specialized field. Lots of research required. Had to really get into character, you know?" Professor Kethril wasn't buying it. "Jake, if you're a shapeshifter, why can't you demonstrate your natural form?" "It's, stuck in this shape. Occupational hazard. Happens to the best of us shapeshifters. Very embarrassing. My supervisor is going to be so mad." I was now edging along the wall toward the exit, but the class was following me like a pack of academically motivated wolves. "That doesn't explain how you know so much specific information about humans," Thorgan rumbled. "Research," I said, my voice getting higher with each word. "Lots and lots of research. I'm very thorough. Ask anyone in the Shapeshifter Academic Council." "There is no Shapeshifter Academic Council," Blorks pointed out. "That's classified information, very secret organization, can't talk about it. Union rules." I was almost at the door now, but Professor Kethril was matching my movements step for step, and his longer legs were definitely giving him an advantage. "Jake," he said in what I'm sure he thought was a soothing tone, "there's no need to be afraid. We just want to study you. For science." For science is apparently the universal phrase that means this is going to be unpleasant for you but educational for us. That's when I made my break for it. I bolted through the door and into the hallway with Professor Kethril's voice echoing behind me. "Security, we have a fleeing research opportunity!" The corridors of Galactic University were a maze of interconnected passages designed by someone who clearly thought navigation should be a competitive sport. I sprinted past confused students, dodging tentacles and crystal formations, my sneakers squeaking against the polished floors. Behind me I could hear the thundering footsteps of what sounded like half the biology department in pursuit. Professor Kethril's voice carried over the chaos. "Don't let him get away! He's the only living link to an extinct species!" I rounded a corner and nearly collided with a maintenance drone, which beeped indignantly and reported me for disrupting optimal hallway flow patterns. Great. Now I was a fugitive from both academic enthusiasm and campus safety regulations. "There!" Zarathez' voice echoed off the walls. He went toward the diplomatic quarter. Perfect. If I could just make it to the human embassy, I could sort this whole mess out. They'd have records, documentation, proof that humans weren't extinct. They could clear everything up and I could go back to being a normal student instead of a specimen. I skidded around another corner and saw it, a beautiful sight of the human embassy's familiar blue and white flag hanging outside a modest office door. Salvation was within reach. I burst through the entrance, gasping for breath, ready to explain everything to the embassy staff and put this whole nightmare behind me. The office was dark. Completely, utterly, absolutely dark. A small holographic sign flickered to life as I approached the reception desk. Embassy closed indefinitely. Reason: species extinct. Please contact alternative diplomatic representative. I stared at the sign, feeling my last hope crumble like a stale cookie. Are you kidding me right now? I whispered to the empty room. Behind me, I could hear the approaching footsteps of Professor Ketherel and his impromptu research team. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was about to be captured by aliens because the embassy that was supposed to help me had been shut down because everyone thought my species was dead. Jake! Professor Ketherel's voice echoed from the hallway. We know you're in there. Come out peacefully and we promise the research will be mostly non-invasive. Mostly non-invasive. That was supposed to be reassuring. I looked around desperately for another exit, but the embassy office had apparently been designed with diplomatic meetings in mind, not daring escapes from overzealous xenobiologists. The footsteps were getting closer. I was trapped in a closed embassy, surrounded by aliens who wanted to study me like a particularly interesting bacteria culture, and my only hope of proving I wasn't extinct had been shut down because everyone already thought I was extinct. This was definitely going on my list of worst days ever, right between the time I accidentally ate those fermented Regalian berries and the day I found out my species was officially dead. The door handle turned. Time to find out exactly how mostly non-invasive alien research could get. You know what they say about desperate times calling for desperate measures? Well, apparently desperate times also call for desperate inspiration. Because as that door handle turned and I faced the prospect of becoming the galaxy's most reluctant research subject, my brain finally kicked into gear. Wait, I shouted as Professor Ketherel and his academic entourage poured into the embassy office. Before you drag me off to your lab, don't you want to know the real reason humans are listed as extinct? Professor Ketherel paused, his forearms frozen mid-reach. We already know the reason. Bureaucratic incompetence. That's what they want you to think, I said, channeling every conspiracy theory documentary I'd ever watched. But the truth is much more interesting. Zarasovan's antennae perked up immediately. More interesting how? I took a deep breath and committed to what was either the most brilliant or the most idiotic plan I'd ever conceived. Humans aren't extinct, I said slowly. They're in hiding. Hiding? Blorix gurgled skeptically. From what? From exactly this, I gestured around the room full of eager alien scientists. Think about it. What happens when the galaxy discovers a species that everyone thought was dead? Unprecedented scientific interest, Professor Ketherel said automatically. Academic fame and fortune, added Zara-7. Research opportunities, Thorgan rumbled. Exactly, I said, warming to my theme. And what does that mean for the species in question? The room fell silent as 37 alien minds processed this question. They become lab rats, Pip said quietly. Permanent research subjects, Blorix added with dawning understanding. Living exhibits in academic institutions across the galaxy, Professor Ketherel finished, his compound eyes widening with realization. Now you're getting it, I said. So humans made a decision. They let everyone think they were extinct and in exchange they got something incredibly valuable. What? Several voices asked simultaneously. Peace. I let that word hang in the air for a moment before continuing. No more galactic politics, no more trade disputes, no more diplomatic incidents, no more being dragged into alien conflicts or having to explain human customs to confused bureaucrats. They just disappeared. Officially. Professor Ketherel was staring at me with a mixture of admiration and horror. You're saying they chose extinction over existence? I'm saying they chose privacy over publicity. And honestly, I shrugged, can you blame them? Look what happened the moment you thought you'd found one. Within minutes you were planning blood samples and tissue analysis. The silence that followed was the kind of thoughtful quiet that happens when a group of intelligent beings suddenly realizes they might have been looking at something completely wrong. But, Zara-7 said hesitantly, if humans are still alive and in hiding and you know about them, then that means... That means... Jake is either the galaxy's most dedicated researcher, Professor Ketherel said slowly, or... Or I'm exactly what I've been telling you I'm not, I finished. And if I am, then dragging me to your lab and announcing your discovery to the academic world would be the fastest way to ruin the most successful disappearing act in galactic history. Lorx made a sound like a thoughtful burp. He's got a point. Professor Kethrill looked around at his students, then back at me. I could practically see the internal struggle playing out across his face. On one hand, scientific discovery of the century. On the other hand, potentially destroying an entire species' carefully crafted piece. So what are you proposing? He asked finally. Simple, I said. We never had this conversation. I go back to being Jake, the slightly weird exchange student who knows too much about extinct species. You go back to teaching about them. And somewhere out there, humans continue to not be extinct in the most successful way possible. But the research opportunities, 07 started, will be there if humans ever decide to reveal themselves, I interrupted. Which they probably won't if they know what's good for them. But that's their choice to make, not ours. Professor Kethrill was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the thoroughness of someone who'd built a career on careful academic consideration. Jake, he said finally, are you asking me to pretend I never heard any of this? I'm asking you to consider that maybe some species value their privacy more than their place in galactic history. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. Another long pause, then Professor Kethrill turned to address the class. Students, he announced, I think we've learned something very important today about the ethics of xenobiology research. Sometimes, the greatest discovery we can make is knowing when not to make a discovery at all. 07 looked confused. But Professor, what about our notes, our observations? What notes? Professor Kethrill asked with exaggerated innocence. As far as I recall, we spent today discussing the glorbnoids of Sector 7 and their unfortunate time travel incident. Very tragic, completely extinct, no survivors whatsoever. One by one, the students began to nod in understanding. Even Blorx managed what I assumed was their version of a knowing wink. Right, Thorgan said slowly. The glorbnoids, definitely extinct, unlike some species we definitely didn't discuss. And that's how I learned that sometimes the best way to stay extinct is to let people think you're extinct, even when you're standing right in front of them telling them you're not extinct. 3 weeks later, I was back in my usual seat in Professor Kethrill's class, wearing my baseball cap and sunglasses, listening to him lecture about the importance of respecting species privacy in xenobiological research. It had become his favorite topic. After class, as I was packing up my things, he approached my desk. Jake, he said quietly, I've been thinking about our discussion regarding theoretical extinct species that might not actually be extinct. Theoretical species? I said innocently. I'm not sure what you mean, Professor. Of course not, he smiled. But hypothetically, if such a species existed, and if they had chosen extinction as a form of protection, I think that would be quite admirable, a species that valued peace over recognition. Hypothetically, I agreed. That would be pretty smart of them. Indeed. Though I do hope that someday, when they're ready, they might consider sharing their story. Not for research, you understand, just for the sake of understanding. I shouldered my backpack and headed for the door. Maybe they already are, Professor. You just have to know how to listen. As I walked across campus toward my next class, I pulled out my phone and sent a quick message to my mom back on Earth. Still successfully extinct, university life is great, send cookies. Her reply came back almost immediately. Glad you're keeping a low profile, honey. Cookie package sent. Try not to get discovered. Love you. I grinned and put the phone away. Sometimes being dead to the galaxy was the best way to stay alive in it. And the best part? I ended up getting an A in the class. Turns out Professor Kethrill really appreciated students who understood the finer points of academic discretion. Though I did notice that every semester after that his course description included a new line. Students should be prepared to discuss the ethical implications of xenobiological research and the importance of respecting species autonomy, even in cases where direct contact with allegedly extinct species may or may not occur. I think that was his way of saying, humans welcome, but bring your own disclaimers. Not a bad deal, all things considered. After all, we'd been successfully extinct for over 2 decades. Why mess with a good thing now?